All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn Accountants and Advisors China webinar series on market entry into China. You have joined us for the last day of this webinar series, which is all about setting up a business in China. Throughout this week's presentations, we've been looking at a little bit of a roadmap of what needs to be created for companies that are looking to enter the Chinese market. Everything from step one, doing research, educating oneself on the opportunities that exist on China, getting data at one's fingertips to make a proper strategy and analysis on which direction your company should go into China. Most companies, they will always use intermediaries as a starting point as they're establishing their businesses, as they're establishing their brands in China. So that was the second day on Tuesday where we were talking about 6 ways to do business in China, which are basically 6 ways of utilizing different types of intermediaries to help transact into the Chinese market. Yesterday, we were reflecting on representative offices, which is I would say the lowest form of entity that can be established in China. And today we will be looking in greater detail about setting up a business in China and what you do need to consider as part of your pre-investment stage where you're analyzing everything in terms of how to enter the Chinese market. So welcome to today's presentation. Again, I'm seeing a couple of new names that haven't joined in the previous sessions this week. So please, again, something that I love it when people interact with me. So please do interact. I usually categorize people and companies into 3 different slots. I start off with the newbies. The newbies are usually people or companies that have either have found an opportunity, have been approached in regards to an opportunity, and are looking to evaluate that opportunity, gain insight, gain information to understand how they can transact in the market and how they can move forward in this new market. You've then got the startups in China. And these are usually companies that have been established for a period of 1 to 2 to 3, even up to 5 years. It's not just that they've established an entity in China. It could also be companies that have simply transacted for that period of time. And focus has always been on the core functions of the business, which is predominantly sales or merchandising or sourcing or trying to sell services, etc. And there's been a lack of attention on the administrative side, on the growth side, on the compliance side, and that has to, a little bit of focus has to then be placed on that. And then there's the experienced China hands. So these are individuals like myself who've been in China for, I've been there almost 17 years now. At the end of August will be 17 years. Where, we're all trying to gain information. And I think this is such a critical aspect of why experienced China hands come on these webinars. I join a ton of webinars just to further my own education on China because things change on a daily basis, regulations change, and it's always nice to get fresh perspectives on what is happening from different jurisdictions in relation to China. So please, again, nobody's messaged me yet. Interact with me. Let me know who you are. Are you a newbie? Are you a startup? Are you an experienced China hand? It gives me a bit of an understanding of who you are, who's in the audience, and how I can direct today's presentation as well. So don't be shy. Just type in the word newbie, startup, experienced, and that'll give me a bit of inkling of who you are. For those of you that have never joined these webinars, how this works is I teach, I educate you. I will be providing you with a whole bunch of information, about 60 to 70 minutes worth of information. So please do grab yourselves a pen and paper if you want to take notes. Today's presentation is being recorded and a link will be provided to our YouTube channel where it is hosted, and a copy of the presentation will also be delivered. However, nothing beats taking notes. But the best part of any of these webinars is the Q&A, all right? And this is the feedback that I get for every webinar session. So please interact with me. If you've got questions, if you've got comments, put them into the questions section of the control panel. I will stay online until every question and comment is answered. As I said, you are going to get a copy of this, so you can always, if you have to leave, you can always reflect back and watch the webinar recording and listen in on the Q&A. The Q&A in general is always the best part of these webinars because people like to interact, and I hope that you all today will also be interacting. It's your time spent, so use it wisely. On the technical side of things, so I use the system GoToWebinar. I don't own GoToWebinar. I know that during the whole lockdown, people have been in modes of frustration because sometimes they don't have enough bandwidth or they can't connect. That I cannot help you with. If it's on your side, there is nothing that I can do, unfortunately, particularly if I'm presenting. So if you do get kicked off the system, try and log back in. Alternatively, try and look at the help section of the GoToWebinar to see if that will help you in any shape or form. But just remember, recording will be sent to you and you can always look back at that at a later stage, all right? If something happens to me, so that's where I do have to fix things up. So usually if I get kicked off of my Wi-Fi, which it did happen in our June webinar series, it does take about 30 seconds to 1 minute to 2 minutes for me to log back in, get everything up and running. Don't exit. I will be coming back on, okay? I've never ever had a situation where I haven't been able to come back on. So just be patient and I will come and finish off today's presentation and make sure again that everyone gets the recording. So what are we covering today? Today we're covering quite a few points in relation to setting up a business in China. And what I'm trying to highlight in today's presentation is to give you an understanding of what might be the trigger points for you to decide to move forward, what are the type of legal entities that exist. I'll also be touching on the foreign investment law that came into fruition in Jan of this year. We're going to be talking about developing a structural plan for your entity because that is a huge consideration you should make before entry. What is the time frame for registration, process, and the documents that have to be submitted? And then I'll be giving you a little bit of tips at the end. So again, it will be about 60 to 70 minutes of your time today. Again, if you can't stay that long, just note that you will get the recording, okay? To put a face to the voice, my name is Christina Kohler-Colucci. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I have been almost now, I'll have to update this next month, 17 years in the corporate services world, specifically for those 17 years in China. I've worked with over 500 companies on their market entry. My focus is 100% on inbound investment into China, and I help companies with their pre-investment stage, and that can be everything from helping them to set up structures that simply transact from the head office all the way into setting up entities, maintaining those entities, and then predominantly my focus nowadays is on helping companies on the growth aspect. So how to accelerate that growth. And that's where I've also created the China Roadmap method, helping companies to make sure they focus more on growth versus on operations, operational guidelines, and protection issues that one has to think about in China. And if you are interested in learning more about this China Roadmap methodology, you can join our webinar series in August, where on the third day, I will be doing specifically a webinar on the China Roadmap methodology, talking about how it works, the bullet points that you need to think about on each stage of your roadmap, and giving you tips and guidelines on that. So you can register with this link. You'll get a copy of the presentation, or you can go to our website at woodburnglobal.com/events, and you can register for the series, which is all about building your strategy for China. So let's get cracking on today's presentation. So some of you, I'm recognizing the names, have joined for all the webinars Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, so you would have already seen this slide. But for those of you that haven't, I want to start off with this slide because I've listed here probably the top 8 points that are usually the trigger points as to why companies decide to actually establish an entity in China, okay? So the first two are probably the most critical. You know, they have to evaluate the volume of business that's being achieved and the value of business that's being achieved. And that's usually the two main trigger points to start the discussions as to whether it makes sense to set up an entity in China or not. And what I mean by volume and value of business is that they've already been transacting with China, but doing that from their head office or utilizing those 6 types of intermediaries, whether it's sales agents, distributors, licensees, et cetera, to facilitate transactions in China. All right, so you're looking at the volume and the value of the business. The third might be that you are starting to bid for projects and companies in China are saying, well, we have a policy where we will only transact with companies that are registered in China so that we can receive a fapiao in China. And in some instances, they might say, we no longer want to work with your intermediary, we want to receive a fapiao directly from you, okay? So that might be another trigger point where the volume and the value of business together with the feedback you're getting from your customers in China is highlighting that you need to have an entity so you can issue fapiaos. Fapiaos are the official invoices to your customers in China, okay? Might also be that your customers in China are asking you for a local representation, meaning they don't want to deal with your distributors anymore. They don't want to deal with these intermediaries. They don't want to deal with the fact that you are sitting in your head office. They want to deal with someone on the ground that is fully 100% a representative of your firm. Okay, so that might be another push where you say, okay, we need to have now a local establishment because we need people on the ground working for us full time to cater to our customer base. These 2 points, number 3 and 4, are highlighting the fact that you have to have very good communication with your customers. And most importantly, you've got to listen to your customers as to what their wishes are to work with you in China. All right. In terms of point 5, are you being asked to stock inventory? Are you being asked to have inventory on the ground to have better delivery times to customers? Again, this is something that you need to take into consideration. Now, generally speaking, you can outsource that service of inventory, warehousing to logistics providers. But at some point, if the volume and the value of the business is increasing, you may want to have that stock and inventory under your own name, okay, on your own entity. So again, another trigger point. In terms of point 6, do you need to increase your brand image? Now, the whole point of brand awareness in China is the fact that you are a Western firm that maybe companies aren't aware of you at all, right? So maybe you have to do PR initiatives. You have to build up a marketing campaign. You need people on the ground to be promoting your business and talking about your business. So that might be another trigger point for you to actually have a team on the ground that's working for you full time to do that for you. Do you need an office space and warehousing facility? Okay, that's part of point 5 as well in terms of stocking inventory. And another aspect you have to think about is, do you need a showroom in China to display your products or your services? Okay, that might be another trigger point for you to actually set up an entity. Do you need to start marketing locally and supervise those initiatives? And it doesn't just reflect marketing. If you have, or if you are working with a bunch of third parties, whether that is your intermediaries, your distributors, or your licensees, or your sales agents. On top of that, you've got other intermediaries like marketing agencies, PR agencies, and you're using other types of intermediaries like logistics providers and warehousing providers. You may need to have a team on the ground that supports those third-party providers, okay? And you might need a team that works 100% for you to supervise those initiatives, do the necessary follow-ups, and handle those conversations to make sure that no momentum is lost in the market. Now, in terms of my whole China roadmap methodology, the third milestone is all about growth and the acceleration of growth, okay? You want to be able to maintain your momentum and accelerate that growth in the market. And to do that, you might need people on the ground to supervise those actions. Now, there weren't too many people on yesterday's presentation in regards to rep offices because it is something that is getting a bit obsolete, but I'm going to touch on it today in order to provide everyone on here today an overview of all the types of legal entities and how the foreign investment law is going to impact that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because I did it yesterday, but I will touch on it briefly. So what is a rep office? What can it do? And what are its criteria? Okay, so a rep office is a non-legal entity. It is completely 100% dependent upon its parent company from a legal and financial perspective. And it is purely a liaison office to the parent company, liaising on all business activities occurring in the Chinese market. And the most important aspect is obviously defining what liaison means, okay? Liaison basically means that a rep office can only communicate, cooperate, and facilitate working relationships between people and organizations in China. It cannot deal in transactions. Okay? It should not negotiate any deals. It's only a communication facility. All right. So people get really confused by this, and they definitely do things in their rep office that are outside of their scope, which is why many companies now have upgraded themselves to limited liability companies. But I do want people to know that this type of operation exists. Okay. Basically, what a rep office's business scope looks like when you get the rep office business license is it says it can do market research, it can do product displays, publicity activities, and liaison activities. Now, I'll give you an example. I haven't done a rep office setup in probably around 8-9 years because it's just really not common anymore. It's not a useful type of structure for anybody. And the example that I used yesterday of actually a recent rep office that I did was of a real estate company that is headquartered in a European nation. And they set up a rep office because they are promoting the real estate projects that they are developing in that European nation, and they're trying to sell properties to mainland Chinese individuals. The actual sale will be direct between the mainland Chinese individual or their holding structure that they'll set up and the property development company in that nation. So the only activity that this rep office will do now and will do in 5 to 10 years will be marketing activities in relation to the real estate projects that are being developed in that European nation. They will never transact locally, never. It will be purely a cost center with 3 people, 1 foreigner, 2 locals, and that's all they will ever be doing in the short term and in the long term. So for me, that type of establishment completely makes sense, because they're looking for mainland Chinese individuals to invest overseas. And that actual investment transaction will be direct. It won't be done through this rep office at all. And there's no foreseeable future where it will happen through that type of entity or structure. So you've really got to evaluate whether rep offices make sense for you or not. Criteria are very strict for rep offices. You need to have a shareholding company, not an individual, that's been established for at least 2 years. So setting up brand new entities does not work. You have to have a certain level of history. To hire local employees, you must go through a labor dispatch agency. You can't hire them direct. And then you can only hire up to 4 foreign employees, and you must have a registered office address. One point that I've left out here is that you also have to pay taxes on this type of entity. And it's quite a complex formula, but in summary, the formula for the tax rates on representative offices is that you're paying approximately 10% tax on the expenses incurred within that rep office. Okay, so that's rep offices. Now let's move on to limited liability companies. Now, if all of you have done your research, which I'm sure many of you have Googled or Binged, you would have seen these types of names: WOFIs, FICs, FIPs, FILs. You would have seen tremendous amounts of abbreviations. So I want to just explain something to you. The next level after a representative office, it simply means you are establishing an LLC. You are establishing a limited liability company. When you look at the name, there is LTD written at the end of it. So I want people to forget about these abbreviations of WOFIs, FICs, especially with the foreign investment law that has come out in January 2020. And I've put it here because it brings so much confusion to people if I didn't put it here, because they would be like, where's the WOFI? Where's the FI? She didn't talk about the WOFI. She didn't talk about the FICs. So I put it here, but I want to highlight it is a limited liability company that you are establishing, and you are liable to the investment capital you're putting into that entity. Okay? What does WFI stand for? It simply stands for the fact that you are setting up a company with 100% foreign-owned enterprise, meaning that the shareholder is either an individual or a company who is a foreigner. But the entity itself is still a limited liability company. Now, if you look down history, so I arrived in 2004. WFIs were the only entity a foreigner could establish as a limited liability company. And like a rep office in those days, it could do nothing. Now, over time, 16 years later, I've designated it like this. I've kept these types of terminology, as I said, because it brings so much confusion if I don't put it in. How I would define it is that you are setting up a limited liability company, 100% owned by a foreign investor. If you want to use the term WFI, for me, that just means you are opening a type of, or your business scope is going to be a service-oriented business scope. So consulting companies, management companies, restaurants, recruitment firms. If you're just simply doing freight forwarding, that is also a service-oriented company. If you have warehousing, that's separate. So it's only if you are doing service. So it's no import-export rights, no trade, zero manufacturing, zero trade, okay? Again, I don't like using WFIs. I'm just putting it here as a clarification purpose. You're setting up a limited liability company. Then you're gonna see the next abbreviation, which is a FICE, a foreign invested commercial enterprise. And this happened, goodness me, I don't even remember the dates, 2008 maybe, 2009, where suddenly the government came out and said that foreign invested WFIs could now trade, but they had to upgrade themselves to a FICE. This upgrade simply meant you were changing your business scope. The structure of the company was still a limited liability company, 100% foreign owned, and now you could add in your business scope, import-export rights, wholesale trading, retail trading, e-commerce, and manufacturing. Okay, if you guys have questions on this, or if you need clarification on these two types of terms, let me know. Insert your questions or comments into the question section, and I can clarify that during the Q&A, because I know it does bring a lot of confusion. Ultimately, limited liability company being set up. Then you've got domestically owned enterprises, which basically means that they're 100% Chinese owned, meaning a mainland Chinese individual or company is the shareholder. You've got this entity. It can be for any types of businesses. Generally, prior to Jan 2020, the setups were a bit faster for mainland Chinese companies. Their step-by-step procedures were also slightly different. Now, why do I bring up these types of entities? I bring up these types of entities because twofold. One, I get clients saying, Christina, we should have been set up yesterday. And I hired a guy 2 months ago, and he has offered to set up his own company so that we can start transacting tomorrow. I'm like, okay, slow down, slow your horses, all right? So basically what you're saying is you don't have the time to spend incorporating your own structure. You're gonna use a loophole of using an employee you've only known for 2 months to establish his own entity that he has full rights over, but that you're gonna fund in order to start transacting. Okay, you can probably hear from the tone of my voice that that's absolutely not what I recommend to people, but companies still do it because they're in a rush. And one of my highlights from the last 3 days has been, you gotta have patience, okay? Or you just need to be better prepared and planned. Simple as that. But to go the route of using a staff you've only known for 2 months to set up his own company that you will somehow fund, that will then transact for business, and you have to rely on getting your profit out of that when you have no rights over the structure, I mean, that's just putting yourselves in trouble. There's simply not an easy way for you to be protected in that scenario. And that's why I also don't usually recommend VIE vehicles, because that just basically means you have a silent Chinese partner that is running your business. All right, but it happens. So I put it in here so you're aware of it. It does happen. You just have to make sure you've got all the legal issues, financial issues surrounding that fully protected. And just know you don't have rights over that structure, okay? You don't own it. And ultimately, you don't have any rights to the bank accounts, okay? But like I said, it does happen. It is an option that you may want to consider for a short-term period. Then obviously you've got joint ventures. Now, for me, joint ventures in China are like marriages. Many end up in divorces. Many end up in beautiful long-term relationships, okay? If you are going into a joint venture, it just basically means that there is a foreign entity and a Chinese entity that are acting in a partnership together for developing a structure in China. It can be for any type of business or sector. In some instances, you might be in a sector or industry that is prohibited or restricted, in which case you're forced into this type of structure because you have to have a Chinese partner to have the majority shares. The only thing I will say when you go into joint venture structures is, first of all, utilize a lawyer who is based in China, who knows the legal implications of negotiating a joint venture contract to make sure that you are fully 100% protected, and that joint venture contract acts as a bulletproof vest for you if you want to exit, if you want to kick the other party out, whatever it might be, okay? You need that joint venture contract to be bulletproof, all right? Now, joint ventures, again, have advantages and disadvantages. You've got to think about your exit strategies, and you just need to have a lawyer on the ground that helps with those types of negotiations to make sure that their priority are your priorities for the market. And ultimately, you want to have a lawyer who also gives you insight on things to think about when establishing a joint venture. And then you've got the foreign invested partnerships, which are FIPs. And a partnership provides more structural flexibility than the joint venture structures that I highlighted on the previous slide. The FIPs have two basic forms. One is a general partnership under which all partners undertake unlimited liability for the debts of the partnership. And the second form is where you have limited partnerships consisting of at least one general partner and one or more limited partners. Generally speaking, the foreign invested partnerships occur when you're looking at law firms, accounting firms, auditing firms, etc. When you have these forms of partnerships. Now let's look at the foreign investment law, okay? Because the foreign investment law came into implementation on Jan 1, 2020, okay? The idea behind the foreign investment law is that as of Jan 1, 2020, there is now only one single unified law around corporate law, okay? Why did this come into fruition? It's because there used to be individual laws on WFOEs, individual laws on FICEs, individual laws on equity joint ventures, individual laws on contractual joint ventures, individual laws on foreign invested partnerships, and then a law, which was the corporate law, which was for basically everything plus domestic companies. And as you can probably imagine, there were a lot of discrepancies and inconsistencies between all of these laws. And if you wanted to go to court regarding a certain issue, actually you had precedents based on each of these different laws, and it became very difficult for the courts to issue a ruling. So as of Jan 1, 2020, when you are looking at the corporate law, or nowadays it's called the foreign investment law, I don't know why they called it that, it's basically saying that any entity in China, any entity already established, about to come in, regardless of who the owners are, will all fall under this foreign investment law. And the idea is to provide a fairer playing field between foreign invested companies and domestically owned companies. Okay, so that's the idea behind it. So when you are now establishing, if you are a new market entrant and you are looking to establish your entity this year or next year, you will be establishing it under the foreign investment law, no longer under the other laws that used to be applicable, okay? Now, what are the new opportunities for foreign investors based on this law? Well, obviously, some of these haven't come into fruition because of COVID-19, but ultimately what these new opportunities are saying is that you have, as a foreign investor, more rights, not more rights, but you have more ability to sell your products or services under the negative list, which has had another opening last month or early this month. You have more preferential treatment in the encouraged industry catalogs. You are more protected and you have more access to domestic contracts, government contracts. And in addition to that, it's provided existing foreign investors in China the opportunity to take their time with the transition. They have a 5-year time frame to convert their existing entities under the new foreign investment law. Okay, so it hasn't been a priority for many companies this year. It'll probably start becoming a priority for many companies next year to change their structures. There are a lot of structural changes, which I'm not going to focus on today because we just simply don't have enough time to go through all of those details, but I will be highlighting a couple of them in today's presentation. But ultimately, there are changes on capital requirements. There are changes on structural requirements. Most of this is pertinent to joint venture structures. It is not actually pertinent to companies where you are 100% owner of the business in China. Okay, it's more geared towards foreign investors and making sure they have a fair playing field. So for example, if I look at my own entity, when I do the transition, there's really not much I have to do. It's slight paperwork, and I just have to change one line in my articles of association because I'm 100% owned by our Hong Kong headquarters. If you're in a joint venture, you will have to do certain internal changes to your structure that will be reflected in the joint venture contract as well as in the articles of association. Now, when you are going into the Chinese market, I have provided you here with 10 points that I would like you to reflect on when you're thinking about setting up your business in China. The first point is looking at the liability of the company. How much liability do you want to take on in China? Is the answer none, minimal, some, we don't have any fear, we're just going to move forward? It's a thought process you have to have. When you're setting up a representative office, there's limited liability because you're not putting in any share capital. When you have a limited liability company, you are putting in what is called registered capital, and you are liable up to that amount. So to give you an example, there are no minimum requirements in terms of capital to be invested. What I do like and appreciate is if a company has actually gone through the process of creating a budget to understand how much capital they actually need for their investment into China, and then to calculate how much capital do they need to maintain their entity. So you have to look at a time frame to maintain their entity before revenue will be generated and where you can sustain yourself through the revenue that's being generated. So there is no minimum, but just to let you know, if you don't have so much capital at your fingertips, the lowest where I have actually registered an entity has been with the equivalent of 50,000 renminbi as registered capital. And then all the way up to a couple of million USD. So it really comes down to the amount of capital you need to sustain your operation in China. But on the other side, that liability, that capital value will be your liability for the term of validity of your entity. Then you want an entity that's flexible. Now, a rep office can't do very much. In fact, it can't do anything except marketing initiatives and hiring people. So you've got to evaluate the projects that you're bidding on, how you're going to be handling your invoicing, And does your structure have the flexibility to cater to that in the short and long term? Then you've got to look at the marketability of that entity. Now, if you are transacting with any company in China, I can tell you firsthand, people prefer if you have a limited liability company than if you have a representative office. And obviously, if you have nothing in China, then they prefer you have a representative office at least. So you've got to look at the marketability, right? If you have an entity in China, it shows commitment. If you've got a limited liability company, it shows even greater commitment. So looking at those 3 points of liability, flexibility, and marketability are really critical when going in the market and understanding what structure you need. The next point is looking at your business scope. So when I do my workshops, usually what I tell the client to do is take a piece of paper, and on that paper, split it out into 3 sections. Year 1 to year 3, year 4 to year 6, year 7 to year 10. And under each category, write on a bullet point form the activities that you want your entity to do. So first of all, this is going to bring you your short-term goals. What activities are you going to do in your short term? What are you going to do midterm? And what are you going to do in long term within the next 10 years? When you write down those activities, that will formulate your business scope. It will formulate the activities that you want to do in China. And as a consequence to that, it will tell you ultimately what structure you need to have. Okay, so I want every company to do this, right? Take a piece of paper, write down in bullet point form the activities. So I'll give you an example recently of a client of mine. We came out with basically, I think, 50 different activities that ultimately they were going to put in their business scope. Everything from design, trade, so everything from service-oriented to trade-oriented activities. And it was about 50 to 60 different items that will eventually formulate the business scope. And it told them they needed a limited liability company, they needed a type of trading company, so they want to eventually do trade. And they don't want to go through the process of updating their business scope over time, have that additional cost affecting their budget. So they are trying to encompass a business scope that is as broad as possible from day one. So very simple activity for you to do. Take a piece of paper with a pen and you write down the activities that you want to do. And that will ultimately tell you what type of structure you must have. Then you need to have a registered office address. So in China, it is illegal to have a virtual office space. Does it still happen? Yes, it does. So there are providers out there that have found loopholes to this. But ultimately, you are required by law to have an office space, a room number, and the office space needs to be a room with 4 walls. Okay? How there's a loophole is that business centers have been able to provide what I call it the registered office address only solution, which basically means they give you a space that is actually being rented by someone else who hasn't registered their address in that location. So you can't use the space, but you do have a room number available to you. It's registered with the real estate bureau, and you pay a small fee for that. Recently, the Australian Chamber of Commerce, together with the Australian Embassy, they have developed a property in Shanghai called the Australia House. And I've recently had a client move in there simply with a workstation. And due to the tight government relations, the workstation is being registered as the registered address of that company. And the client's only paying about 2,800 RMB a month. So, you know, you can check with places like WeWork. You can check with places that are these types of business centers where potentially you can register your workstation. The key thing knowing is the following, is that you've got to make sure that if you do get any promotional deal by our government, that it is a legitimate deal and that you have a proper lease agreement, you've got confirmation in writing from the promotions bureau or whomever allowing you to rent that property, and there are no issues around that. But you do need to have that space. Then comes down to the name of the company. So So just so you're aware, when you go into China, the primary language is Chinese. Who would have thought? But it is, it's Chinese. What does this mean? This means that any document you submit to the government, any document you receive the government, will be in Chinese. Okay? And it's just a matter then at that point for you to do your translations. Okay? And I say this in regards to things that are related to the government and where the government needs it in Chinese and where the government will produce something to you in Chinese. However, having said that, you can have contracts that are purely in the English language. And it is legal to have English language contracts only in China. It could be that certain translations have to be made to be submitted, for example, to tax bureaus and whatnot, but the English language contract will be the one that is used in the court of law, okay? So this applies also to the name of your company, okay? Now, I promote myself in China as Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. It's my brand name, it's my trademark, it's what I go around telling people I am. But when I registered my company, I registered my Chinese name. Do I use it? No, I only use it on my FAPIAOs. That's the only place you'll actually see it. And it's obviously on my business licenses and whatnot, okay? But when you create your Chinese name for a limited company, you're gonna have the name of your company, which is about 2 to 4 characters long. You can do it as a direct translation of your company name, of your English company name. You can do it as a direct pronunciation of the English name, or you can just create a new name. And then you've got the type of company. Now, this is critical regarding the type of company because the type of company is reflected in your business scope, which is why I wrote business scope as the first activity you should do. Because if you have only service items in there, then you will be a type of service-oriented company. So for example, we are a management consulting firm. If I just recently had a client that is a media communications firm. That's all service-oriented, okay? If you are in trading, you will probably, if you're in generalistic trading, you'll just have international trading as the type of company. If you're in manufacturing, you will have the name of the product, the generalistic name of the products you're producing as part of that name, okay? And then you have company limited at the end because you are a company, a limited liability company. With the rep office, oh, and you also have the name of the city where you're establishing. Where you are a rep office, it's the same concept, okay? But rep offices aren't limited liability companies, which is why you've got rep office at the end there. So it is very important to come up with 2 to 4 character long names. It is very difficult to do that because your name has to be unique in the registrar within the city that you're establishing. And I have had clients take it so far as getting a feng shui master to come up with hundreds of names in order to get a good name, a good, solid, good luck name registered for the company. So not an easy task, and it's usually one of the biggest obstacles that companies have to go through. Then you got the capital aspect, okay? So I've left total investment here and the reason I shouldn't have left it here is because under the new foreign investment law, there no longer is total investment. However, from a practical standpoint, I have done now a handful of registrations in 2020 where the total investment amount still needs to be provided, which is why I've left it here, okay? But in theory, under the foreign investment law, it shouldn't be a number you submit. Ultimately, the registered capital is the physical money that will go from the shareholder's bank account into a capital account that is owned by the Chinese company. The registered capital is the money you actually will use as working capital to fund your business until income can be generated and that income can sustain the entity, okay? The total investment concept is that the total investment is a larger amount that is ratioed off against the registered capital. And the difference between the registered capital and the total investment is what I always nickname the emergency funds. So let me give you an example. You might say the registered capital is 70,000 US dollar. The ratio is 7 to 10. That means the total investment will be 100,000 US dollars. The difference of 30,000 is what is called your foreign debt loan. And it's the only foreign loan you will be able to obtain in China unless you apply for local loans. You need to have currently, previously you didn't, but what I'm experiencing lately, especially during COVID, is that you need to have a separate loan account established, which does take time to create. But that's why I say these are emergency funds, because a lot of people during COVID-19 have been using those emergency funds to sustain their entities in China. Okay. There are no minimum capital requirements, none. So if you wanted, you could put 10,000 renminbi. I've never had a client do that, but how far would 10,000 renminbi get you? Okay, you want to make the assumption that then income is being generated overnight, okay, to sustain itself. A lot of people are very uneasy about designating an amount. And I can understand that because they have a sense of fear for China and bringing money over there. So I'm here to calm that fear. The registered capital, if you are worried, put a lower amount because you can always increase it. You can never decrease it. So if you realize you need more, you put more in, you go through an application procedure to do that, okay? The registered capital only has to be input into the account. First of all, it must be input, but it only has to be input within the term of validity of your entity, which is something you designate during the setup. And the minimum term of validity is usually 10 years. And the maximum term of validity of a company is 50 years. Okay, so if you choose 50 years, then you have 50 years to input that registered capital. It's a long time. Okay, so nobody is pressuring you to put any amount from day one. Obviously, you'll need some because you might have some expenses. Okay, but nobody's forcing you to put in the full amount from day one. It can be brought in within maximum a 50-year time frame if you choose 50 years as your term of validity. Or if you choose 10 years, it's 10 years, 25 years to put it in, okay? But it is an important aspect because a lot of companies run out of cash very, very quickly. Somehow, everyone burns cash within their first year of operation. And most of the time what I'm seeing is that it's because of a financial controlling aspect or because of things they didn't realize. So for example, you realize that within the first 3 months, you need to terminate your general manager and compensation has to be owed. You realize that the costs you had calculated within your budget were inaccurate and there are higher costs than anticipated. You realize that your landlord has suddenly increased your rent by 20%. You have to pay more. So there's so many things that could happen in the first year that are not necessarily guaranteed. Now, this sounds like there's a bad faith in business. That's not what I'm saying. You know, I was put into a situation where I started off my business in a business center back in the day, and the owner of that property had increased the rent to the business center, who in turn increased it to us by an exorbitant amount. It was almost by 50% of the rental amount, and I was forced to leave. So I left. I found a cheaper place to go to. But I understood the business. I mean, I didn't understand it at the time because I was so angry, but I understood the position of the business center. We were put in a very difficult spot where they had to in turn increase to other people. So things like that will happen, okay, where you might not have control necessarily. But it's very important to calculate a proper registered capital amount and just know, one, you can always increase it. Downside is that is your liability, so you might not want to increase it too high. Two, you've got a foreign debt loan that can always act as emergency funds. And number three, you have the term of validity to input that. So if you extend that to 50 years, you've got 50 years to put in that capital. All right. Then you've got to develop the corporate structure. So you've got to know who the shareholder is going to be, or shareholders. You've got to know who's going to be the authorized signer on behalf of the shareholder. You've got to decide, do you want to have a board of directors or do you want to have an executive director? There will be a legal rep who's the legal face to the entity and probably has the highest liability as an individual holding that position. Doesn't mean it's bad. People always assume that's the worst because it's China. It's not that. Then you need a GM and a supervisor. Now, I just want to highlight one thing. The names of these individuals and their passport copies are going to be provided to the government. It does not mean you have to put the person you've only known for 2 months in China who's acting as your GM in these roles, okay? Anytime you've got turnover and a change of people, you have to go through a 3-month process application to change that name. All right. So it's usually between 8 to 12 weeks that it takes to do any change associated with the back end of your business. I have had a client, for me, it's the biggest story, where I think in an 8-month time frame, they did a change almost every 8 weeks because they had very high turnover in the head office. So you need people who are going to be stable. You need people who are going to be in charge of the China business. Depending on the size of your organization, you want to create a simple structure, not a complicated one. If you don't have enough people, then talk to a corporate service provider or a lawyer to understand how they can help. So for example, at Woodburn, we provide supervisors. I am a supervisor when people don't have the ability to have additional hands. So lawyers do the same type of thing. Other providers do it too. So understand how you want to create it. And there is, I know, a lot of anxiety for individuals that are put in these positions, especially if you are an SME, because they feel, I don't live in China, I'm not going to be residing in China, so how do I know everything is going to be above board and clean? There are ways of doing that so that you limit your anxiety. I would want every one of my clients to make sure they can sleep at night, okay? So don't have so much fear in this. If you obviously perform criminal activity, that's where you should have fear. Okay, if you've done something bad, there will be repercussions. If you don't do something bad, you are absolutely fine. Okay, so when you're creating these structures, corporate structures, really think about stability. What individuals do you want in there? Are they willing to take on those roles? Understand what those roles and those responsibilities mean. Explain that very clearly to the individuals that are going to be holding those roles. And if you have a lack of people, see if you can outsource some of those roles, etc. Okay, but you don't have to have necessarily people you've just known for a couple of months go into this system. Okay, so to give you an example, people automatically assume that their Chinese general manager has to be appointed in there. He does not, or she does not. Okay, in the government system, you can put whomever you like in these roles. It doesn't mean that someone with a general manager business card representing your company has to be in that system. All right, think of it as two different things. Of course, if you want them, by all means do it, but just make sure you have the protection around it. So I've done webinars that have been purely on this topic because there's so many considerations you have to make. So if you do have questions, do let me know. You can put it into the question section of the control panel. Then obviously the last 2 points, points 9 and 10, are regarding human resource aspects and ongoing operational costs that are associated with these types of structures. So in terms of human resources, one thing definitely I recommend startups to do is outsource their payroll. You might not have the capabilities internally to handle it, or even the knowledge level to know that you have to open a social insurance account, a housing fund account, and handle all of that through those accounts. So when you're in your startup phase, you might want to outsource that aspect, but still continue to educate yourself on it so you're aware of how it all pans out and how it all works. In terms of ongoing operational costs, whatever entity you set up in China, it has to have accounts, has to have financial management reports produced on a monthly basis. Value-added tax, if you're a general VAT taxpayer, is paid monthly. Then you've got profits tax that is paid quarterly. You've got annual compliance procedures like an annual audit that has to happen for any structure. You have your annual profits tax filings. You've got annual inspections that are statistical reviews of how your year went, how your previous year went. So there's a lot of administrative functions that have to occur. And this is where I say it's very important to have operational guidelines in place. Who is doing what is being performed in-house, what is being performed or what is being outsourced, okay? You need to have these clear guidelines. And you just need to be partnering with either individuals that are employed by you or with outsourced providers that give you full transparency over all of this. Now, I also understand what you don't know, right? But this is where the education part becomes so important. Educate yourself through webinars, through chambers of commerce, to understand what you don't know and to get clarity on that, okay? So if you guys have questions on this, let me know as well in the question section portion. Time to register. So when you register, it is a very old-fashioned process, although it is picking up and becoming more digitalized since COVID. So because the governments didn't want face-to-face meetings, a lot of things have been able to be done on submission online, which has been great. But then you still have to submit paperwork in person once the online approval is provided. So be prepared. You will get a stack of A4 papers that have to be signed. Those papers actually have to be in Chinese, but you should get English translations. The English translations will never be submitted, but I do recommend getting the Chinese versions, getting the English translation so you know what you are signing. You need that transparency. And the last point is probably something that you guys will think I'm joking about, but I'm really not. You have to sign everything with a black ink pen. If you sign with any other color or any ballpoint type of pen, it is considered a disrespect when you're submitting the documents. So you do have to sign with a black ink pencil. So what is the process for establishing your entity and how long does it take? Now, here's an example of a limited liability company. A rep office would be much shorter, okay? So the first step is the name approval, where again, for some clients of mine, it's lasted between 6 to 8 weeks because it's been impossible to find names to be accepted. We try to help you with that in terms of limiting that time frame, but it can take time if you're very picky about the name. If you're manufacturing, you'll have to do an environmental license application to show your manufacturing process. Does it produce any waste? And what do you do with that waste? Then you do the online registration with the Ministry of Commerce. And then you go through the process of the approval with the Administration of Industry and Commerce as well. And then you get your business license. Once you get your business license, everything happens relatively quickly thereafter. You'll have your chops and seals produced. You'll do your tax bureau registration. You'll open your bank accounts, and then you'll do the trade. If you are in trading, you'll do your customs registration and import-export licenses. Now, the time frame for all of this is usually around 50 working days, of which about 30 is simply the bank account. So since 2004, when I started registering companies in China, it's been a complete change on how the local governments have improved their internal processes, sped up their reviews, and have been producing business licenses super quickly. Bank account openings, just like anywhere in the world, are tedious because the banks have to do a know your client process. Now, one of the good things is that if you are doing your market entry right now and you're setting up your company, one of your questions might be, because this has to happen globally, a representative has to meet with the bank face-to-face. Now, there are border controls, visa issues, and whatnot. So lately, whoever is the associated legal rep, we've been able to do video conferences through Zoom, photos, and couriering original passports to China in order to not delay the opening of bank accounts. And banks have been relatively flexible on that as long as they get the approvals from the People's Bank of China. Choosing your bank account is also something that's very critical, something you should think about. Again, I've done webinars purely on that topic in terms of bank accounts because there are quite a lot of considerations you have to make in terms of who you want to collaborate with. Documents to be submitted. So these are all the documents to be submitted. And I guess point 3 is one of the most critical, which is the double notarized shareholder documents. So again, during COVID-19, this has been a bit of a dilemma because consulates and embassies, Chinese consulates and embassies have been shut down. So companies have been restricted in terms of being able to obtain the authentications and notarizations from the Chinese embassies. So what this basically means is your business license of the shareholder or the passport copy of the shareholder has to be notarized by a Chinese consulate embassy in your jurisdiction. And this has caused a few problems. Now, for most jurisdictions, except right now the US, I think, it's pretty much open. You can email them. You might have to show why you're asking for this so quickly and suddenly. Sometimes we have to provide from various zones or government authorities letters to say they're investing and we want their investment, so notarize. And it's been helpful to then speed up the processes. So these are pretty much all the documents that have to be submitted in multiple copies, which is why it's quite a big stack that has to be produced. So to end today's presentation, what are my tips? The first is pre-investment advisory and market research. So, this has been an overview for you about setting up a business in China and what structures would suit your business and how to go about doing that. Under each category, you have to go more in depth to know exactly what your next steps would be and what you have to do. So definitely take the time to do that. You've got to understand your short and long-term objectives and goals, okay? This is so important. Don't just focus on your short-term goals. It's useless. You've got to have a vision for your entity and your structure and think long-term. And, it's everybody's goal, particularly as COVID has happened, is to reduce administrative costs. Your aim should be to reduce administrative costs. So don't make mistakes and have to do things double, okay? When your provider tells you to do something, follow their instruction. They're not doing it to make you angry. They're doing it because they don't want you to incur more costs than are absolutely necessary, okay? So I said this once in a speech. If you are using a lawyer or you're using a corporate service provider, listen to them. You are paying them to help you. So listen to their advice, listen to their instructions, particularly at the time of the incorporation, okay? They're not trying to mess around with you. It is complex. It is not as straightforward as this presentation has highlighted sometimes, okay? I don't control the Chinese government. I don't control their decision-making processes. I cannot guarantee anything that, I'll just show you, that in this step-by-step, it happens exactly like that. I might get informed that actually we have to do step 4 before step 3. And that's just because of the guy that's sitting at the counter, okay? I might have to do step 2 where step 2 is, and in other jurisdictions, in other cities, I might have to do step 2 at step 10, okay? You have to be able to be flexible enough, and your corporate service provider is not there to get you angry. These are all guidelines, okay? They are not set in stone. And in your mind, you have to be flexible to listen to what they're saying. We're not trying to make you angry. We're also frustrated when it's not as clear cut as the government says. But it is the way it is, and you just have to follow it, okay? And listen, most important, listen to what they're saying to you. All right, so if you guys are interested, if you guys are planning on setting up your businesses in China and you want to have a discussion or get, you're already using a provider, but you want a second opinion or I'm happy to talk to you about my experiences, how things have been working, particularly during COVID, and how things are improving with the foreign investment law as well. So I'm putting the meeting link here. You can set up a meeting directly in my diary, by all means. If you want to connect with me on WeChat, you can connect through my ID, which I'm also putting in here. And you can also email me to my email, which I will also put in here as well. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll just put the name that I'm registered under on LinkedIn as well. Feel free to have a conversation, no problem at all, not mandatory. It's just a brainstorming session, free of charge, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, as you wish. And so let's get cracking on certain questions that come in. There's only been one question from Rich. So Rich is asking, been selling in China through a reseller distributor for many years, and we've seen significant growth in the last year. So we feel we should be growing our operation there to provide a stronger presence. either to understand the market better or to be able to do more development activities. Oh, Rich, sorry, I thought there was a question at the end of there. I think you're just introducing what you're doing. I think it's great. I think, that's a trigger for you. So you've actually seen significant growth, which is always extremely positive, and now you're taking it to the next step and looking to establish something on the ground. And that can be in a variety of different forms. So if you've got any questions, Rich, in regards to the content from today, don't hesitate to just type it in. If anyone else has got questions, I'm going to be hanging on here. Not so much interaction today. All right, Grace, thank you. In terms of procedures of setting up a WOFI, what's the difference before or after the new rule? Grace, I think you're assuming, I'm making the assumption you're referring to the foreign investment law. In terms of the actual application procedures, there's simply no difference at all. The application procedures are exactly the same. Yeah, it's exactly the same. I think probably one thing that I'll highlight that I didn't mention earlier is, if you're registering a company in a big city like Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, even places like Hangzhou, Ningbo, Wuhan, where there's a lot of foreign investment going into those cities, the governments are quite familiar with the reviews of the documentation. Whereas if you go into real manufacturing areas that might not have a lot of foreign investment, be prepared that your corporate service provider will have to do a lot of traveling in order to do things face-to-face. So I'm having that situation right now with one client. They're setting up in Changshu, and even though they have an online system, and even though there's COVID, they're not doing anything with the online system. And we've had to do every single submission, raise a question. They don't take it by phone. We have to travel there in order to get the answers and get the feedback. So that is very old-fashioned. And funnily enough, on the day of submission, we had to wait as they were doing the online application. And one of my team members was teaching them how to do it, how to do the online application. So, it's one of these things where, if there's a cluster of foreign investors in a certain area, things will probably go smoother and faster. If you're going to a more outer area where maybe there's not so much foreign investment, you may find just that it's more of a hands-on process than usual. But in regards to the foreign investment law, Grace, really, in terms of the physical application, there's no real difference before or after. It's just in relation to the content. So to give you an example, when you are setting up a joint venture now, in terms of having a board of directors, you can have a board of directors that is fully on just one party versus having an equal amount from both parties. So yeah, that's just one example. It's more, the foreign investment law is more in relation to the content versus the actual application procedure. I hope I answered that properly. If you guys have other questions, please feel free to ask away. Again, I'll be staying on. Again, if you want to set up a meeting in the chat box, so if you look at the chat section, I've sent it to the entire audience. You'll have all the details available to you. And just to highlight, in August, we've got this webinar series called Build Your Strategy in China. We're going to be talking, so I have a guest speaker called Ellie Adams from Kiva Global. She's a market research analyst, and she is going to be doing Monday and Tuesday session, talking about creating a business strategy, creating specifically a sales strategy. She's going to be looking at very good case studies that she's worked on that really highlight the importance of having a proper strategy in place. On Wednesday, I'll be talking about the China roadmap methodology, which is great to do if you're in the strategy phase. And then on Thursday, I'll be talking about how to execute your strategy. What do you need to think about when you're executing? So if you're interested in that, you can go to woodburnglobal.com/events and register. You do have to register for each event individually, or basically pick and choose what you want to come in and listen to. If you want to know more or be reminded of these events and dates, please join our newsletter. You can subscribe on our homepage, and you'll get updates consistently regarding our events. There are still no other questions that have come in, so I think I'm going to leave you there. For those of you that have joined since Monday, thank you so much for being here for 4 days. Greatly appreciate that. Love it when people join for the whole week. For those of you that have not been able to join and want to listen back in, all the webinars from the last 3 days are on our YouTube channel. If you go to our homepage on the top right-hand side, there's the YouTube logo. Click on it, it goes straight to our page. You will be getting a copy of today's presentation together with a link of the recording at the end of the day. And in the meantime, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. And I'll speak to you all again very soon. Thank you and goodbye.